Right, apparently I'm all mic'd up. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity, Ellie, for speaking to just about here.
Just that, sorry,
Oh, okay, no. So I know where the clicker is. Thank you very much today for the opportunity of speaking to you about will supercities destroy national economies. Before I even start, how many people, can I just show a show of hands, how many people are actually living and working in London from the room? How many people are living and working in Greater London, South East? Outside the South East? Okay, a few. Outside the UK? Okay, right. So this question, as far as I'm concerned, centralisation and distribution, will supercities destroy the national economy? In my view, and this is my personal view, I think that they do. And the reason for this is for two reasons. One is undue concentration of wealth, power, and economy and culture in one place is damaging to the national economy. And secondly, the forces of risk connectivity threaten cities in a way that the barbarians at the gate threatened supercities in the past. So over here we've got a chart that actually shows the centralised model in which we operate today, where London is a pivotal role, acting as a concentrator of knowledge and the flow of individuals to the city-state that is London. Now, this is all well and good. You can see the flow quite clearly there. But at the same time, you can see the flow out into the regions. And this is something I want to sort of highlight later when I get into the distribution of wealth as well. So we have concentration of people in one place, but those people are pretty much geared towards focusing on the opportunity. And that's because, in people's view, opportunity exists in London, and London only within the UK. In my view, we need to move to a much more resilient and distributed society where opportunity exists all around. And one of the reasons for that is that as we move from the offline to the online world, opportunity flows all around us. And we should be looking at the opportunities in a way that's presented locally that we can actually provide globally. So, the whole supercity aspect is nothing new. Urbanisation has been growing throughout from the 18th century. In fact, in the 18th century, which doesn't show up on this graphic, only 3% of the world's population lived in what is termed a city or an urban conurbation. Somewhere between 2010 and 2014, we moved to a society where more people lived in cities than lived in the rural regions. Moving on to 2030, when London finally becomes a megacity, by the UN definition being 10 million, 1 in 8 of the planet will be living in megacities, and the aggregate population of these 41 cities that appear on the UN graph to my left and right is just shy of 1 billion. So urbanisation is there, it's been growing gradually, so what do? Well, the first thing we have to do is actually define what supercity is. Supercity is the concentration, as I've iterated earlier, of economic, political and cultural power. By any measure, London is streets ahead of most cities. But the one aspect to bear in mind is that in the leading economies, and particularly the leading economies in the world that is 2030, Brazil, India, China, and the US, that particular paradigm doesn't exist. And in the top 10 economies, maybe we're only talking about France, Japan, Tokyo, France, Paris, and London, UK, where that actual paradigm exists. So we have to be mindful of what seems to be working and what might not seem to be working. And the other aspect to all of this is that the one thing that makes London so great, and as driving in a taxi today, admiring the skyline of London, it's actually where people want to be, so let's not get too negative about it. It's a great place to be. However, if we're going to watch the competitive forces that I'll allude to later, we need to be mindful of the fact that we need to actually integrate better into the economy. So the next few graphics are rather boring, but they're actually quite important to illustrate the way in which a super city function and a super city status can actually affect the average person. The first thing I'm going to focus on is wealth. So the most important and startling aspects of all of this, there are 10 nations that combine and aggregate together to actually hold 73% of personal wealth. Now, this is actually echoed similarly in corporate situations. If you took all of the corporates globally, I don't mean corporates, all companies globally actually, there is about 180 million companies as defined by Dun & Bradstreet and actually corroborated by Bureau van Dijk. The combined revenue of those companies is somewhere north of $215 trillion. It's actually very similar to that number on the board there. And if we were to focus on the billion-dollar club, those companies, they're actually whose revenue ends up being just around $1 billion and above. 1/3 of all revenue of companies is actually contained in those 1,000 companies. These 1,000 companies are so big that the sun never sets on some of their enterprises. So we're dealing with a scale that's probably unprecedented in recent time. So this also is quite interesting. Surprisingly, London being number 2 and quite close to New York. But there are 11% of the same wealth distributed in just 15 cities. So this one is an interesting aspect. So by far, the biggest economy from a GDP city perspective is Tokyo. But London still remains in the top 5 position. Interesting enough, probably sharing the same attributes as New York and LA combined. But if we were to look at London separately as economy by itself, it actually functions as a G20 economy just. And the UK without London is a G10 country just. Now, when I was trying to put this together, I was trying to illustrate how wealth could be distributed or prosperity could be seen across the country. So I came across this graphic from Barclays Bank. And this is the thing that's probably most stark in the sense that the flow of people from the regions into London and then the flow of people from London to the southeast and the east of England echoes quite well in this prosperity slide. First off, London being the most prosperous area, the next being the southeast, and the next being east of England. So there are the concentration of wealth as people migrate back out of London, having migrated in the first place. But actually, if you start looking north of that region and west of that region, the prosperity picture is completely different. And arguably, the Brexit vote is actually contained quite similar in this graphic, albeit with the cities removed. Because we actually already have a two-state system, in the sense that wealth is concentrated in and around London and not necessarily flowing out to the regions, which is probably systemic in some respects, but reflects the fact that people view opportunity mostly in London, and that's where everybody wants to be. So services is the driver, as echoed by Sadiq Khan this weekend on the Andrew Marr show, dominates the British economy. The most interesting thing besides the domination of services is actually what's happened to agriculture from the 18th century, occupying quite a prominent position in the 18th century in terms of share of GDP, and now operating just 1%. Arguably, it's it's almost a meaningless contribution. However, the most startling aspect to all of this is that actually it feeds 60% of the population with just 1% of the GDP. A mark of what's to come, a mark of how technology can actually affect a sector and drive inefficiencies. So much manpower isn't needed. And I guess this is the beginning of maybe what digitization could do for us, both positively and negatively. So the service drive exists not just in the UK, it's actually in the G5, China being the most notable expansion point in recent times. And you know, when we look at China, we view China as a product company, a product country, sorry. But that's actually beginning to change, and that rise there is quite startling if you actually compare that to the other countries in the graphics. So this one's interesting. This one's interesting purely for the fact of how services are taking the share of income within the UK, proper 12 sectors within the UK. And the reason why I've actually laid this out is that it actually shows a healthy penetration of services across the regions in the UK. And as was aired in the Andrew Marr show, and I'm not plugging that, it's only because the numbers are the same, really. So I came at this from a completely different perspective, and we ended up with the same number. But the reason for why this is so important is that when you get to the next slide, you begin to realize how productive, and this is the measure, true measure of GDP, how productive other parts of the UK are. And really, if we're going to start to fix the problem of over-concentration, this is what the beginning of the picture is, and what the focus point of the national policy making should be. Just a few percentage points changes in the aggregate could mean a lot of change nationally. So how do we start to look at that? Well, the first thing we need to be mindful of is, apparently there's somebody from JLL here today. Somebody from JLL here today? Yes? Thank you for this slide. I was looking for a slide that actually...
I wasn't personally responsible for that.
Yeah. Oh, you will take responsibility today. Take it. I'm offering it to you. I was really keen to come across something that helped me position the argument. Not that I was scrambling around. It's quite important to actually bring in lots of different viewpoints. And the JLL graphic, which actually came from WF, but since then I've actually managed to look it up. There's no surprises here on the one aspect. The top 7 is the top 7. But what's more startling for me is the lack of any other UK city in it. And that just shows our reliance, even from a present or from a future perspective, on London. We used to say that the US, when the US catches a cold, the world catches a cold. Actually, if the US and London were in the same event, that would aggregate and cause us great harm. So that is actually the beginning of my whole distributed aspect. How do we guard against the resilience of that? The first thing we've got to begin to realize is that the event space, global events, and we don't need to go too far, some of the events of the last week have really started to crystallize the way in which the world is moving. Arguably, you may say that we've rebooted and woken up in the 1980s. We've got a movie star president. We've got the beginnings of a Cold War. We've got Russia that seemingly is doing its own thing. However, what we've got to do is actually begin to understand some of the reasoning for those events. And in my view, what's really driving this is the fact that from the 60s and 70s, we've gradually coupled businesses. We've outsourced, we've insourced, we've cut supply lines, we tried to optimize our inventories, and as a result, I suppose today, all businesses are more tightly coupled. A shock locally is felt globally. A shock globally is felt locally. In fact, local is global, global is local. So we're already in the state where events can aggregate and cause us harm. Now, the classic one is the cyber situation. There's a lot reported of cyber record hacking and extortion and monies being paid and fines being levied. However, not a lot has been said of the nation warfare that's going on behind the scenes, hitting key assets and stealing corporate IP. Allied to the fact that we have tension in the world, the haves and the have-nots, east, west, offline, online. We really are in a truly connected space. And it's this aggregating risk, the connected risk, that we mostly need to understand and begin to get our heads around, because for the first time, this risk knows no boundary. So, uncertain worlds, lots of risk, but actually there's lots of opportunity too. And it's the opportunity that I want to focus on today, because I think that enough said of the risk. If we ever were scared about risk, we would never trade globally, and we need to reach out and actually seek the opportunity when we see it. So, from my perspective, this flag means a lot of things, and I'm not on a political stage today, even though I'm on in a think tank. But really, I grew up in the 80s. The sick man of Europe is what people said about the UK. Quality was a million miles from any product or services were delivered. Today, we're in a slightly different space. The Foreign Office views itself as global Britain. London happens to be a global city. 75% of UK customers trust made in Britain, and 60% of US customers view made in Britain as quality. But it's not just the quality agenda we need to focus on. We need to seek into the brand and actually understand the relationship in history of tolerance, innovation, and trade. These things have actually been working in harmony or disharmony at different points throughout history. But in the end, we're a trading nation, and we need to actually exploit the opportunities that creates. And the central pillar for that is innovation, as I see it. So, how do we rebalance towards a more resilient economy? Nowhere in this am I actually viewing London as a negative. London is a true positive aggregator of risk and opportunity. How do we disseminate it to create opportunity that's inclusive for all? To actually create the least route to market, the most optimum route to market. I think the one thing from all of this is to understand is that from the winter of discontent in the late 70s, I think, government's been a constant. It's gone from one colour to the next, but it's been fairly constant in the way it operates. Yes, we've driven some costs out, and then we loaded it back in again. But out of all the Western economies, the local tax take is the lowest in the UK. So we're actually missing out on local people making local decisions to help them within a national policy that actually is focused on helping us move on and be more resilient. So I think government needs to change, but it can actually help others to change by actually focusing on innovation, talent. The infrastructure is needed to encourage that relationship so that we can actually export more and create stronger, resilient, sustainable relationships. So let me begin by the innovation piece. This was a graphic that I found from the university, or not university, it was the Bureau of Statistics in the US that gave a tight correlation between numbers of universities and GDP. Now, in the UK, we're fortunate in the situation where 16 out of the top 100 universities are actually based in the UK. 4 out of the top 10 are based in the UK. Arguably two, if not 3 out of the top 5 are based in the UK. We're in a quite interesting situation where universities are contributing 3% towards GDP. But I don't necessarily just want to focus on universities. I mean, universities arguably could be in the next industrial age, the equivalent of the cottage industries of the past. But these need to be brought into a framework that actually encourages the development of talent. This isn't just young talent. We should be recycling older talent because we don't want to be in a situation of having the same generational mistakes made time and time again. We need a sustainable, growing economy. So how do we do that? Well, we do that by actually creating policies that actually focus on the development of talent. Now, to some extent, football didn't come home, but St George's Park did play a pivotal role in at least changing our view of football performance. But it's actually shown no better than actually in the way in which Team GB and the Paralympics bodies have actually managed to be so successful. They're focused in on what matters and use data analytics to actually enable them to succeed, and sports science. So we need to have a system that actually encourages talent, and the way in which I think the role of government has to be to orchestrate throughout. Not necessarily meddle, help, be the budget holder, but actually help the coordination between business and talent. And talent really is nurtured through schooling into universities, rather than business always moaning about the lack of talent. Actually be involved in a debate to shape the talents. But of course, then we need the infrastructure and the healthcare and the welfare to support the best talent, because talent could exist anywhere. I mean, it could be in Tatooine, who knows? Right, so infrastructure. I suppose the infrastructure point, I mean, I live in Nottingham. I'm already a distributed company. I'm a net exporter. I'm moan and groan about the trains, but in the end, I know it's going in the right direction. You've just got to believe it's going in the right direction. But I think a system that's integrated, available, affordable to the people wherever they're seated within the country is important. A strong link to London in the short term is important. A system that actually enables us to deliver clean, affordable energy is also important. But in the end, technology and certainly innovation and talent development can actually help in this area. We're actually just about to actually move into a system where we're going to have the drive towards the Internet of Things. So we're going to be flooded with data. We should be using this to actually help drive innovation within the infrastructure system, to actually make it more available, cheaper, and accessible to all. Because in the end, we can use all this technology that we've learned. We can export it in the same way we did in the past. And building those links, not just nationally, where the orchestration role is pivotal for the UK government, but actually allow local links to form. So there was a graphic earlier which showed London Heathrow being the top connecting airport by cities. Interestingly, when I looked down the list, 14 on the list was Manchester. So I'm pretty sure the Premier League has actually helped there. And we could laugh about the Premier League, but actually anything that actually helps promote Britain is important, and sports are actually an integral part, as is culture and politics. So, with the national and local government aspect, I've already said, growing up from I was born in '64, by the way, so I'm pretty old. But my first memory of politics was actually Winter of Discontent. And from there on, really, I think rather than disconnecting with society, because we're living in a quite changing time, I think government needs to refine its focus and actually operate in an environment that actually encourages as much local interaction as possible. So we can only do that by actually devolving some power and allowing local economies to actually develop and flourish in a framework that works nationally but also encourages local entrepreneurship. So I'm hoping in this way we're actually in a situation where we're much more distributed, much more connected, and ready for the opportunities that a distributed model can create. So thank you for your time. Ellie, I think at this point, as you said, it's time for Q&A. And just when the mic passes by to you, if you could just, if you do want to ask, oh, here we go. If you could announce yourself, sir. Be gentle with me.
I certainly would be. I'm Bernard Herman, a member of Chatham House. One thing I think, in your excellent talk, one thing you did neglect to mention was the political aspect, which frequently underpins, or is the result of, the growing discrepancy between the large cities and the rest of the country. We see this in the United States of President Trump. We see this in Europe. Increasingly, we're seeing this in Britain of Jeremy Corbyn. Would you cover the cities as the innovators, the agents of globalization, would increasingly be the new division within politics, with the globalized cities and the national hinterland, and there'll be the constant tension between the two, in that in many countries, the majority of the population will not live within the globalized cities. You did not mention this in your excellent lecture, but would you care to comment?
Right, could you actually give me, so is your argument that...
Growing split between globalized cities and national hinterlands and how they vote and influence each other.
Yeah, well, arguably the Brexit vote was the revenge of the cities that didn't matter, right? So if we just focus on the UK for a minute, right, because I'm not a politician. I'm here because I'm generally passionate about this subject, because I want us to all succeed. I voted to remain, but I'm actually in a situation where I'm actually quite intrigued about the opportunity on the other side. So I think we need to actually be an inclusive, we need to operate an inclusive model. I'm completely aware of the fact that cities dominate. Cities are almost creating the ability to actually set their own trading relationships, right, at the expense of the national government, or undermining the national government in some respects. But if we want to avoid the situation of Brexit, then we've got to find a way of allowing innovation to flourish, or opportunities to be available wherever, anywhere. In a distributed system, and particularly in a digital world, we only have to look at what's happening to social media and the development of superstars without actually having ever lifted, you know, a corporate pen or even left the bedroom, right? So we are creating new routes to market. We're creating new opportunities all the time. But we don't want to be in a situation like we were in the 80s of leaving parts of society behind. If we keep doing that, we will have the situation of supercity v hinterland. There's enough experiences with the barbarians at the gates to what will happen. I don't know whether that answered your question, sir.
I'm Kenneth McIntosh, Chatham House. I'm very interested that you seem to believe that we should decentralise a lot of power and influence from our one megacity. And it's quite exciting to see what might be happening in Manchester and thereabouts, and perhaps a little bit less so in Merseyside. And then you move...
Sorry, I don't believe we are devolving any power at the moment.
We've devolved some money.
Yeah, money.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
We've devolved some power and some money to Scotland, and it's failing spectacularly. Their educational system is failing in the primary and secondary schools. Their universities are really struggling because of this wonderful idea of free education, so the whole of Europe wants to come for free education, so much that they're restricting Scottish entries to universities. Mm-hmm. Their local government's not doing terribly well. How are we going to address that? Are we going to have to take back control, or are we just not going to... I'll stop there.
No, please. I'm actually... You were going to say something else, and please finish. No? Okay. Right, okay. Interesting question. I think, and this is my personal view, it's slightly off the subject, but because I'm intrigued, I'll answer it, because I can. It's a free world. I think that we don't have a, we're a union, but we don't have a national union policy. It's not really inclusive. We've devolved, but without actually really devolving. So that's created tensions in the sense that it's actually allowed people that want to split a situation where they can do, to some extent, whatever damage they want to do. However, I think that from the national perspective, we shouldn't necessarily view too negatively on the situation in Scotland. I think we should learn from it. Learn how to actually embrace that level of devolution and how we can improve it. And actually, again, I mean, you mentioned Manchester. We're in danger of the actual cities being barons of the north all being a different colour to national government. But then, what does it matter? We need a national identity and we need a national policy that's actually outside of politics. To some extent, the politicians are probably meddling too much in state of affairs and actually holding back innovation and infrastructure and talent development, and leaves the average person with no choice but to seek opportunity in the super city.
So would you allow some regions to fail economically?
I think there's enough, well, let's not focus too much on the city. We know enough, we've got enough experience of what works and doesn't work in the health system to learn how we could, and in the rail system. Now, nobody actually learns anything without failing, so failure isn't a bad thing. So I think we should learn to fail, because as long as we improve and get better the next time.
Peter Price, former member of the European Parliament. My question is, what can we learn from other countries in the sense of where in the world would you point to a country which has made choices that have led to success in achieving a greater balance, and especially things moving out of the large cities towards the other places within the country as a result of choice, not just that the country is big and therefore things have grown up in other places?
Well, that probably isn't one that comes to mind that I can think of, to be completely honest. But I'm going to answer that question slightly differently. We're a quirky nation, and we've got people that's successful or probably never gone to school, never gone to university. We've developed in different ways. And the thing about from the outside in is that everybody wants to come to London. And the UK actually stands for a beacon of opportunity in that respect when you entwine it with the London experience. However, also to some of those successful nations that you cite, the big countries, most of the citizens there want to come to the UK because they see opportunity, not just in London, but elsewhere. Chinese are building strong links to other parts of the UK. People see talent outside the UK. Maybe we don't love ourselves enough.
Are you suggesting, therefore, that the UK has actually been relatively successful in distribution of...
I think it's starting. It's been a slow exercise. It's starting. The BBC moving up to Salford. The FA thinking about giving up Wembley, setting up St George's Park. These things are all recent. I think the Labour government tried moving parts of the government across the regions, and the next government, the coalition, came and changed that. So I think it's an experience that's been going up and down, but it's in the hands of the politicians that keep on changing it one way or another. I think we've got to begin to realise that outside of London there is lots of opportunity and lots of innovation if encouraged. to some extent, the government has to almost be a farmer. It needs to recognise the opportunity and to invest in it properly. Because in the end, what are we left with the centralised model? Does it just get bigger? And do we have the situation where the people outside just vote against it for whatever reason? Because that's what will happen.
Hi, Ashutosh Shastri. I have a follow-up to the question that Peter asked.
Oh God, you're double tagging me now, aren't you?
No. The question is, Peter's remarks got me thinking about should specialist-driven cities such as Los Angeles or Bangalore or Frankfurt for finance. So is Germany one of those answers of creating different specialized cities and therefore diffusing the problem of centralization? But the second question really is, should such cities actually aspire for megacities? Is it a prize worth fighting for?
What, to become a megacity?
Yes.
Well, it'd be interesting if we look forward in 10 years' time, if we could do that. Because I think a lot of these studies don't necessarily factor in the impact of the online world. The online world doesn't know a boundary. And as I intimated earlier, businesses are so connected, there are no boundaries. At any one time, it's aggregated at a point, so people feel as though they need to be in it. But if our jobs are changing and everything's becoming increasingly online and accessible, we actually potentially, if we don't do this, have the reverse situation. This could be, in 5 or 6 years' time, Liverpool as it was after the 80s. I'm just throwing it out there because why not? I feel this is going to be a funny question. No?
No, actually quite serious.
Oh, God.
One of the aspects that, Janice McLean, member of Chatham House, one of the aspects that I'm particularly interested in is in anti-money laundering and so on. And London is a centre well known across the world that it's one of the biggest focal points for laundering money. Have you taken this into any account when you're judging the size of where you place London in this and the percentage of the economy of London that is actually unlawful income?
Well, to be brutally honest, I don't think we've got a choice, have we? Because what would happen?
I'm asking you if you're actually taking that into account in describing London as a super city, because there are obviously other bigger cities, there are other richer cities, and a sub-point of that is, are you looking at, income per head or wealth per head of the population? Or how do you balance that? Because there are wealthy pockets all around the world. It's just that London has different attractions, but unfortunately one of them is that it's a centre for money laundering.
Yeah, I mean, London is a concentrator of wealth, as I've said already in one of the slides. It's the second most concentrated city for wealth after New York. And the danger is, as you quite rightly say, what happens in a situation where we become slightly distributed and more liberated to that money. Now, I'm not a policymaker, but I can only give you my views. I don't know what percentage of that money is laundered. Maybe you might want to hazard a guess. But if it's
Actually, no, but we know that's a considerable percentage, and that is always going to be a part of how you come to your decision about London being a super city.
So you don't think London is a super city?
I don't know. That's why I'm here tonight, to hear what your reasoning is behind it. But a big part of this is the fact that we've become this centre for money laundering, and therefore how much of that is good or bad for the country. But for me, have you taken that into account in your research?
I suppose from that perspective, my definition of the super city is the concentration, economic, political and cultural power. We don't actually have any other city that comes anywhere close when you combine the three. Part of it does, part of it doesn't. And the other aspect to all of this is that London happens also with the lens of the UK economy, act as a pivotal aggregator for politics. So it can take the money, but also set policies that actually helps to actually change in the way in which we're seen and how we integrate. So in the end, in the short term, we're not going to see this money disappear, because where else can this money go? It can only go to New York for full service, from what I'm led to believe. New York wouldn't touch it.
Saad Al-Douri, I'm a researcher here at Chatham House. So I think more than ever, we live in a time where multinational companies have greater influence over issues of governance, alongside obviously the national governments. I think you could quite easily make a link with that and the kind of protectionist measures that we are seeing around the world today. So, with that in mind, how do you see the interaction between multinational companies and governments in addressing this issue of decentralization, when arguably, multinational companies don't necessarily see it as beneficial to them to take their money out of London, take their money out of other big cities, and take it into Birmingham, Liverpool, or other cities?
Well, the Foreign Office views itself as global Britain. Can somebody tell me what that means? But I think I can only offer up what I think it means. I think the UK actually wants to be a pivotal position in global politics. In that state, we are constantly wrestling between citizens' needs, the needs of the companies, and the needs of the trade relationships between our trading partners. So we'll find a way. We will find a way, because we always do.
Yes, Duke Oputa, Chatham House member. To what extent will tolerance of transnational migration contribute to the growth of super cities in the future, especially from the point of view of attracting talent from around the world, as opposed to from only within the country?
Mm-hmm. So how do we manage migration?
Well, for instance, take Trump's rhetorics on migration to the US. Will that help to build super cities in the States in the future, or will it actually be have a negative impact in that respect?
Well, actually, for the first time, I think I was talking about this earlier, for the first time, what we hear and what we see may not be what's happening, because there are powers that are at work here. I probably think it's due to East-West have-nots, online, offline. We're actually moving to an environment, if we're not careful, where policy making isn't elevated across that agenda, where if we're not careful, corporates have more and more control. And if they have more control, there is no super cities.
Andy Parfitt, Chatham House member. Really connected world that you've alluded to a couple of times. The promise of connectivity was that it was always going to reduce the concentration that you've also talked about, but physically that is. But actually the trends show that it hasn't done that.
Not yet.
So, well, yeah, so Silicon Valley famously, Los Angeles for music and for filmmaking and so on. And I wonder what you think is going to change to reverse that trend that we've seen over the past 15, 20 years.
When people realize they can trade themselves and seek opportunities themselves and have a platform to engage directly with their target audience. which is already happening in the entertainment industry. So when we get more and more connected, and the regulators don't wake up to more, I suppose, flexible schemes, then we run the risk of the customer becoming even more powerful and knowing his own route to market.
I hear that, but I think in my experience, even the entrepreneurial state sort of start-up individual small businesses have still tended to concentrate physically in those areas of the world where already those concentrations exist.
Yes, yeah. So you know, whether it's a science park or a hub, yes. But as I've alluded to earlier, there is even opportunity in Tatooine, and Hollywood actually plays quite an interesting part in actually opening up some of the challenges that we're facing. So I don't want to talk too much. I'm starting to dry up.
Hi.
Oh, Ellie, we've still got another 10 minutes. Where is she? Oh, there we go. We're almost there.
Nicole Zaz, King's College. I had a question about development and bring back to the earlier questions tonight about how these cities have been a driver of economic development.
Sorry?
How these megacities have been drivers of economic development.
Drivers, yep.
And how governments are seeing that and trying to maybe use that model in creating these new science parks and other technological cities. I was wondering if you can comment on the possible future success of those cities.
Possible?
Future success of those cities in driving development and driving the national economy away from just super cities to more dispersed.
I think that if you look at that JLL graphic, Washington is a city that's actually contending, but actually there are another 3 or 4 cities in the US that are actually trying to contend within that space. But I think if we come closer into the UK and maybe extend it to include Ireland, Dublin's up there on the list as a developing a city and one that's actually trying to actually compete more globally. But I think I'd like to cite Manchester. Well, actually, if we looked at the GDP contribution of Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, and one other, Liverpool, those 4 cities, if you combine their GDP contribution, it's probably only half of London's. But I think the policies of maybe moving the BBC up to Manchester and the success of the power of the Premiership and the effect that has globally has actually helped the city, because it's actually directly correlated to the number of flights coming into Manchester. Manchester is a very, very busy airport. So I think that we are seeing the beginnings of that in the UK, but at the same time we struggle to join the ends up. We don't have the infrastructure that really works. We have a lot of vested interests, but I'm confident that if we use some of the opportunities that are presented, like the Brexit scenario, and I don't mean to Brexit out, I mean the wake-up call that says we need to actually do something that actually is much more inclusive. That will actually help in promoting talent locally and rebalancing the economy. Because in the end, that's what's really needed. Otherwise, we're going to lurch from one vote to the next as people find other excuses as to why we shouldn't be together. Wow, this is really learning my crust here today, aren't I?
My name's Benjamin. I'm actually a student. I study international relations at Exeter.
Good man.
So I suppose I'm sort of target of this, as I myself am looking for a job after university, and it's about opportunity, it's about where am I going to go.
Right, so you're a student. Have you just graduated or graduated?
I'm graduating next year.
Next year, right,
Yeah.
okay. So when you graduate, what do you want to become?
So that's the full question. Obviously, there are different paths you can take studying international relations.
Mm-hmm.
But the question is, where do I want to work? What's the opportunity? That's a very interesting debate. So why would I choose Manchester over London? Why would I, vice versa? And yeah, there's more opportunity in London, it's true, but even if there was equal opportunity in Manchester, it's more than that, I think. London's a hub for recent graduates. There's more than just opportunity. There's culture. There's all your friends who are going there as well. So how can you make Manchester? How would you incentivize a student to want to go to Manchester to work there instead of London?
Right. First off, I share your pain. The way I'll answer that, and I'll answer it very quickly because I'm mindful of the time as well, is that I was actually watching the England-Spain game last year. And the reason why I say this is there was a young chap that actually represented the FA. I was in the FA box. He used to work at Manchester United in the marketing department, had his own flat in a very posh part of Manchester, but gave all that up because he wanted to move to London and he wanted to work at Wembley, and now he was sharing, with three other people. It's a difficult one because everybody sees the lights and everybody wants to come to London, which is why 30% of all graduates are actually wanting to go to London. It's a huge aggregator from that perspective. But if we look at the landscape around universities and science parks, things are beginning to change. And I think we've just got to give it that time, create the opportunity, create incentives, give people the financial incentive to want to go there. At whatever age, it doesn't have to be a young person, an older person, because I think that talent needs to be recycled. So I don't know whether that answers your question. But I've got a smile out of you, so I probably did.
Thanks. Nicholas Cumleben, Greenmantle. You've outlined some very convincing things that the public sector and the government can do in figuring out the questions you're asking, especially with the way it's easier nowadays to work from anywhere. Do you see a significant role for the private sector in this, and if so, how?
Private sector in
terms of dealing, basically sort of reducing the influence of these super cities in the way that it's a lot easier to now work remotely and work from anywhere. Do you think the private sector can play a significant role in this?
Well, absolutely. If the private sector and government works together, it can change. People's attitudes can change quite dramatically. So I think that we need to actually move to that. But we, at the same time, we need to create an integrated society, not the expense of London. London is actually, it should be encouraged to grow. But we will get to a sticking point in London when we actually get to a population of greater than 10 million. You know, how difficult has it been for Heathrow to get its planning permission through? If the city keeps growing, we'll need another one. So what then? So we've got to be mindful of the impact of undue concentration. And we can do that by actually investing in creating cultures that enable the bright lights to stand out in other parts of the UK.
Hi, I'm Geert van der Van with Bloomberg Global Data.
Bloomberg?
Yes.
Oh,
first of all, thanks for the chat and answering all of the questions coming your way. I was wondering, given the multiple aspects that we've discussed so far of megacities, is there any evidence that shows what the effect on the environment is of both the rise of these super cities and the eventual decentralization that might follow in the future?
My concern in answering that is that you have children born in a megacity that probably never touched a tree. They just never lived in the woods and never experienced nature, so it becomes something that we're not real to. So, I mean, that's the way I would want to answer that, but you can carry on the question if you like.